That sentence wasn't pulled from a horror novel or whispered in a lunatic asylum. It's from a real 19th century journal entry, sealed by the family and locked inside a rusted vault in northern Maine. And that was just one story from one bloodline. What if I told you insanity doesn't just happen, it runs in families? That generational madness is not a coincidence, but the direct result of rituals, contracts, and allegiances formed long before America even had a name. We're not talking about random tragedies. We're talking about deliberate engineering of lineage. Families sculpted by pain, minds cracked on purpose. Curses not born, but handed down. In this video, you're not just going to hear creepy stories. No, this is a descent into something darker. You're going to feel the shape of control. The way power uses families like laboratories. You'll see how certain lineages in American history were never meant to be free. They were owned, spiritually, institutionally, genetically. And while you've been told that institutions like asylums, orphanages, and reform schools were built for healing, I'm going to show you how they were designed to contain and multiply the very curses they pretended to cure. Tonight, we trace the bloodlines no historian dares publish. The Winscotts, the Haldermans, the Tremaines. The roots of their wealth, sinister. The shape of their madness, systemic. Some families weren't cursed by chance. They were built to break. Every family has secrets. But some secrets were fed, fattened, and locked in basements for generations. You were never meant to hear this. But now that you're here, you can't go back. Keep watching, because what you're about to learn isn't just about them. It's about you. And the hidden institutions still using family as a weapon. Welcome to the descent. They always tell you madness skips a generation. What they don't tell you is, who decides which generation breaks? In the early 1800s, the Tremaine family owned over 9,000 acres in Vermont. Their estate was magnificent, towering columns, crimson drapes, gas-lit hallways. But behind the elegance was a silence that made servants whisper and children weep in their sleep. Because every firstborn son for 6 generations ended up confined. Not to prisons, not to hospitals, but to soundproofed rooms within the home itself. They said it was epilepsy, a hereditary imbalance. But why did the walls of their rooms have ancient markings? Why did maids report waking to the sound of chanting when no one else was awake? And why, in 1872, did the local priest burn their chapel down himself, then disappear? What if madness in these families wasn't genetic but engineered? What if bloodlines were shaped like architectural blueprints, layered, pre-planned, and activated at the right time? Let me pull the curtain further back. In 1847, a secret psychiatric ledger circulated among elite physicians across the Northeast. It was handwritten, stamped with wax, and never officially recorded. Inside were case files on families like the Tremaines. It wasn't about curing them. It was about tracking patterns of inherited ritual abuse, generational psychosis, and what one doctor called voluntary ancestral possession. Let that phrase settle in your mind, voluntary ancestral possession. It means the madness was invited. By the 5th generation, the sons weren't being born mad, they were being groomed to inherit something inhuman. A presence that stayed in the blood. A will that passed down like property. This wasn't illness, this was occupation. And the institutions that should have intervened, they helped design it. Hospitals didn't treat these lineages, they preserved them. Doctors were chosen for their allegiance, not their education. And in every town where these families lived, the same pattern followed. Local clergy going missing, burned records, entire generations disappearing. This isn't about superstition. This is about ritualized madness passed down as inheritance. The true American elite didn't just pass down money or land. They passed down dark contracts. And the worst part, some of these lineages still walk among us. Let me ask you something. Who benefits when a family goes insane? The easy answer is no one. The correct answer is power. Understand this. Madness in elite bloodlines isn't an accident. It's a mechanism, a tool, a system of psychological combustion designed to fracture the soul and extract something deeper. Something useful. The Winscott family owned mental institutions in 4 states by the turn of the 20th century. On paper, they were philanthropists. But if you follow the blueprints of their buildings, something disturbing emerges. Every wing constructed in a Fibonacci spiral, every patient room faced magnetic north, and at the heart of each facility, a chamber with no records, no medical purpose, no exits. These were not hospitals. They were ritual sites disguised as care centers. And the patients? Mostly drawn from their own extended bloodlines. That's right. They built asylums to house their own kin. But not to help them, to harvest them. What were they extracting? Not just data, patterns, behavioral codes, psychic blueprints. When you subject a mind to generational trauma, ritualized, repeated, encoded with symbol, you get something more than madness. You get predictability. You get obedience. Now ask yourself, why were military officers and bishops frequent guests of these facilities? Why were the Winscotts invited to European occult gatherings while their cousins screamed behind iron doors? Because what they learned inside their family's madness was profitable. There's a reason powerful bloodlines keep their black sheep hidden. Not because they're embarrassed, but because they're valuable. Controlled insanity becomes a currency, a forge for breeding obedience visions, and in some cases, something much worse. I'm not saying these families just went insane. I'm saying they weaponized insanity, institutionalized it, trained it like a dog in the basement, and they fed it with each new child born under their crest. This is not just dark history. This is a system older than America, a playbook passed through European blood cults, perfected on this soil, behind curtains of wealth and philanthropy. And you've only heard whispers. Until now. You think your mind belongs to you, but the tools they perfected in those basements, they're now used on the public. Welcome to the inheritance of madness. The deeper you go, the more you realize it wasn't just about madness, it was about control through blood. Let me introduce you to the Halderman lineage. Quiet, wealthy and assuming. Their farms stretched across Pennsylvania like veins, but their true legacy wasn't agriculture, it was obedience. In every generation, one Halderman child was selected, removed from school, hidden from public records, raised in isolation, trained in silence, and given only one book, a handwritten manuscript passed down since 1761, bound in animal skin, written in a cipher no one has fully cracked, because it doesn't obey standard language, it obeys symbol. Every page of that book detailed rituals, postures, colors, sleep patterns. It trained the child not to think for themselves but to receive, to become an antenna for something older. We know this because in 1973, a fire destroyed one of the Halderman barns. Inside, investigators found rows of chairs, each bolted to the floor, facing west. Behind them, carvings, not in paint, in bone. The bones of family members, arranged in patterns consistent with ancient sacrifice symbology. Let that settle in. They used their ancestors' remains as components in a living ritual. Why? Because they believed memory could be preserved in flesh. That by placing the right bones in the right patterns, they could awaken knowledge from the dead and transmit it into the selected child. This wasn't religion, it was engineering. And when these children turned 18, they vanished. No public record, no graduation, no employment, gone. Only the family's wealth grew, only their political donations increased, only their influence expanded. Are you starting to see it now? The madness wasn't random, it was a doorway. These families used trauma, silence, and blood to program identity, to erase self, to replace instinct with allegiance, not to a nation or even to each other, but to an ancient design. One Halderman journal, recovered and decoded, included the phrase, "We are not raised to survive. We are raised to obey. And if we obey well, we are allowed to remember." That's not madness. That's ritualized subjugation. And don't think this is ancient history. Because the same techniques, sensory deprivation, symbolic conditioning, ancestral manipulation, are now used by global institutions. You just call them programs. Let me ask you something. Why do the same families keep showing up at the top, even when history burns to the ground? Civil wars, market crashes, plagues, revolutions. No matter what collapses, their names remain untouched. Their wealth even grows. Why? Because these lineages aren't reacting to chaos, they're designing it. Enter the Calder family. On paper, nothing sinister. A lineage of East Coast bankers and lawyers dating back to 1789. But peel back the public face and you'll find something far more engineered. In 1921, a private archive from a now defunct monastery in Rhode Island revealed a series of Calder correspondences. These weren't business letters. These were instructions, ritual directives, calendar-bound actions tied to lunar phases and blood cycles. What were they coordinating? The shaping of events through symbolic timing. The Calders believed, and practiced, that world events were more effective when aligned with ancient rites. Economic collapses, political assassinations, public panics, each had to occur during preordained ritual windows to maximize psychic yield. What's psychic yield? It's the energy of collective fear, grief, and confusion, harnessed not randomly, but intentionally. When enough people feel the same emotion at the same time, it creates a frequency. That frequency, when tuned properly, becomes usable. You think the stock market crash was just economic mismanagement. The Calders timed it to extract emotion at scale. And it worked. They increased their wealth by 400% over the Great Depression. How? By knowing exactly when to pull out. Because it wasn't about fortune-telling, it was about ritual orchestration. Collapse was a ceremony. The Calder crest isn't a bird or a lion, it's a serpent consuming its own tail. The Ouroboros. The eternal cycle of destruction and rebirth. Their motto? From ash we shape obedience. Every institution they touched, banks, courts, psychiatric boards, adopted forms of ritualized control. Not by spell or candle, but by policy. Bureaucracy is the new altar. And what happens to the families that resist? The ones who won't offer a child, won't obey the rites, won't sign the paper in blood. They're erased, quietly. Financially, socially, medically. Until their story becomes a footnote, a psychiatric case, or a suicide no one questions. This is no longer about families gone mad. This is about families that learned how to manufacture madness in others. And now, they've scaled it. Every man has two fathers, the one who raised him and the one whose shadow he never sees. It's time you learn about the Morrison lineage. They weren't industrialists. They weren't bankers. They weren't even particularly wealthy by conventional standards. But they held something far more powerful. The original American blueprint for social silence. In the early 1800s, the Morrisons acquired land just outside Charleston, not for farming, not for homes, but for what they called memory fields. Land that was never to be built on, only walked, ritualistically, at night, by members of the family, barefoot, in total silence, following invisible trails only they were trained to perceive. This wasn't superstition, it was neurological reprogramming, a way to fracture identity and then implant a new one. Each Morrison child by age 12 had completed what the family called the descent, a 7-night process involving isolation, sleep deprivation, and hallucinatory immersion in underground chambers. Witnesses from nearby towns described hearing what sounded like two voices coming from one child's mouth. The goal? To break the mind just enough to let something else in. It was never about healing, it was about replacing. One survivor, disowned and later institutionalized, described it like this: you don't go mad, you get hollow, then something climbs inside. Here's what makes this lineage different: they didn't seek control through wealth or politics. They sought it through perfect silence. Their entire power came from their invisibility. No scandals, no headlines, no hairs on the covers of magazines. Just shadows in courtrooms, medical boards, publishing houses, and psychological foundations. They learned early that real control never draws attention, that the loudest voice is the easiest to trace. But the quiet ones behind the curtain write the script. You've read about brainwashing in governments and cults. But the Morrisons pioneered it, on their own blood. They created the beta template of identity fracturing now used in black ops, private intelligence, and MK projects that still run in silence today. You think you know who you are? You think your thoughts are your own? Let me ask you this. If your grandfather was fractured and rebuilt by a system like this, how would you even know? Because silence doesn't just protect secrets. It erases them. And the Morrisons. They were masters of psychological extinction. There's a reason you've never heard of the Duvall family, because every time their name appears in public record, it disappears 5 years later. They were erasers, not just of people but of realities. In 1932, a census worker filed an official report from rural Tennessee, a township listed as having 312 residents. A day later, the records showed 311, no trace of the missing individual, no birth certificate, no death certificate. But here's the twist. The census worker vanished too. The only constant in the surrounding reports, the Duvall estate, an isolated plantation that had stood since 1791. Locals called it the Quiet Acre. No mail, no lights, no visitors. But every decade, a new ledger arrived from that address, sealed, notarized, and delivered to a post office in D.C. It was a registry of disappearances, page after page. Names, dates, symbols next to each, not public symbols, esoteric sigils. When decoded, they referenced ancient Babylonian rites of erasure. Not just death, spiritual deletion. See, the Duvalls weren't just isolating madness. They were extracting people from consensus reality. Let me say that again. They learned how to make people vanish so thoroughly it was like they never existed. And the most disturbing part, they didn't hide it. They offered it as a service. Clients of the Duvalls weren't locals, they were elite. Men and women of immense influence who had a problem, a child who saw too much, a spouse with dangerous memories, an unwanted heir. They came to the Duvalls not for murder, but for elimination. Total psychological erasure. The Duvalls were the architects of non-existence. They used a cocktail of hypnosis, trauma, ancestral mapping, and ritual binding to strip identity down to the bone, and then scrub the memory from the collective record. You think this is impossible? Let me remind you, Every major intelligence agency in the 20th century attempted this kind of psychological weaponry. But the Duvals had been doing it for generations. Quietly, effectively, with no fingerprints. The last known document from the Duval estate was dated 1979. After that, the house burned to the ground. Arson? Perhaps. But some say they simply ascended. Because when you master reality to this level, you no longer live in it, you control it. You've made it this far. You're beginning to understand this isn't about ghosts, or curses, or haunted houses. It's about design. Let me now take you to a name whispered only in confidential files and sealed psychiatric transcripts. The Fairborns. Their home stood in the Black Hills of Western Virginia, miles from any town. A fortress built not with stone but with calculated geometry. Every wall constructed to exact mathematical ratios found in ancient sacred architecture, ratios believed to amplify consciousness or fracture it. And that's exactly what they did. From 1893 to 1957, every child born to the Fairborn family was placed into a program they called cleft. A term that appeared repeatedly in personal diaries and sealed letters, but no one outside the bloodline ever understood its meaning until a defector spoke. She was 34 when she escaped the estate. After 2 decades of silence, she described cleft as a ritual of identity splitting. Not figurative, literal. The child was subjected to alternating cycles of reward and trauma, so precise, so deliberate, that the mind began to fragment. One part held the pain, another held the obedience, a third held the watcher. By age 9, each Fairborn hair was a system, not a person. A collection of selves, separated by command phrases, colors, or touch. And here's the horror: this wasn't a curse. It was a program. They were designing functional dissociation, multiplicity, programmable personalities, what we now call complex dissociative identity formation, but without the stammering diagnostics and clinical sympathy. The Fairborns did it on purpose. Why? Because they didn't want children. They wanted tools. Obedient, contained, and when needed, switched. You think this sounds familiar. That's because this exact method was later found, mirrored, in classified intelligence programs, projects with names like Bluebird, Monarch, Artichoke. But the Fairborns, they were doing it a century earlier. Privately, perfectly, with generational precision. This isn't the kind of insanity you cure with medicine. This is engineered madness designed for function. And the deeper question becomes, function for who? Because these fractured hairs didn't stay in the estate. They became diplomats, artists, judges, policymakers, people with power, but no unified self, puppets for hidden hands. The ultimate sleeper agents. And now, it's your turn. If you've seen what's behind the curtain, you must choose to remember. Comment below, twice, the phrase, "I see through the blood," not just for the algorithm, but to seal your place in this descent. Your transformation is underway. You've crossed the threshold. From here forward, you're not just listening to forbidden history, you're walking through it. Let's now speak of a family the government refuses to acknowledge. Despite 6 sealed investigations, multiple psychiatric interventions, and a full congressional hearing that mysteriously vanished from the archives, their name was the Ellisons. They lived in silence, yet influenced everything. From 1910 to 1984, every known Ellison male held a government contract, not military, not intelligence. Something stranger: symbolic logistics. A classification with no job description, no salary trail, and no retirement benefits. When asked about their work, they all gave the same response. We're not here to serve the people. We're here to watch the signs. That phrase reappears in over 40 leaked field reports. Reports that detail strange assignments, decoding graffiti patterns in subway tunnels, photographing geometric scars on asylum patients, recording audio from churches during electrical storms. What were they looking for? Resonance. The Ellisons believed history isn't written in ink, but reverberation. That certain phrases, symbols, or numbers, when repeated, begin to take shape in reality itself. And those who know how to manipulate these reverberations can bend consensus. They weren't tracking people. They were tracking psychic footprints. Entire neighborhoods were mapped based on emotional energy patterns. Cities were redistricted to align with geometric lines. Every family that resisted found themselves under psychiatric surveillance or labeled domestic threats. This was not paranoia. It was a war for perception. And the Ellisons were the cartographers, but they didn't start this work. They inherited it. Back in 1783, the first Ellison immigrant arrived in Philadelphia from Germany. Not with gold, not with land deeds, but with a collection of obsidian mirrors. Tools used in pre-Christian Europe to scry not the future, but control the present. These mirrors were coded into family rituals, placed in birth rooms, hung at burial sites, passed down as sacred anchors. What did they reflect? Not your face, your frequencies. That's what made the Ellisons dangerous. They weren't manipulating politics. They were shaping reality itself through frequencies embedded in culture, media, even language. You were taught that history is linear. They knew it was programmable. And every word you've heard up to now has been a code, unlocking your ability to see the structure. That sound in your ears right now, that's not noise. It's reverberation. You feel it now, don't you? Not fear, but alignment. The sense that something hidden is snapping into place. Because once you start seeing the pattern, you can't unsee it. Let me take you to the Black Orchard incident, a name you'll never read in textbooks, yet every intelligence archivist knows by heart. In 1896, 147 bodies were discovered buried in concentric rings beneath a church orchard in Black Hollow, Virginia. The corpses were not victims of a massacre. They were members of the Brenlow family, a lineage with no surviving descendants on record. Each body was marked, not with wounds, with etchings, carved into the flesh with surgical precision, circles, spirals, glyphs. None matched any known language. But one pattern reappeared on the spine of every child, a triangle with a single slit through its center. That same symbol appears in classified asylum blueprints from 1935 on the interior doors of isolation chambers. It shows up again in secret Air Force memos from 1959, under audio trigger sequencing. And again, in 1991, in a Black Ops document titled Project CON. So who were the Brenlows? They weren't just a family. They were a pilot project. Their home was a church, yes, but not Christian. Their worship involved silence, geometry, and controlled suffering. Infants were raised in darkness for 6 months. Spoken language was denied until age 4. Pain was introduced ritually, with specific sounds played through pipes embedded in the floors. Why? Because the Brenlows believed trauma, applied with exact timing, could open a gate in the mind, a psychic aperture, a channel, but not to God. To the architects. That's what they called the voices that came through when the children broke. And they weren't hallucinations. Multiple recordings recovered in 1937 showed children speaking in languages they were never taught. Languages no modern scholar could translate. But soundwave analysis revealed one chilling fact. Each child's voice matched frequencies found in ancient seismic activity, earthquake resonance, planetary vibration. Inhuman. They weren't going mad. They were being rewired. The orchard was not a burial site. It was a containment field. And when the local sheriff tried to blow the case open, he vanished. And every document was scrubbed. But the triangle remains. You've seen it in corporate logos, as military insignia, hidden in children's shows. It is the key, and you were never meant to notice. The deeper we go, the more one truth rises to the surface. Madness was never the disease. It was the disguise. Let me introduce you to the Caro family, a dynasty that held no political office, yet shaped more laws than any senator ever has. You won't find their names on campaign posters. You'll find them in the footnotes of mental health legislation, tucked deep into advisory boards, hiding in the think tanks that tell nations what's safe to think. From 1908 to 1972, every Caro heir was enrolled in a program simply referred to as the 13. No school, no friends, no outside contact. For 13 years, each child was isolated in a facility designed to mimic reality, but only partially. The floors weren't level. The clocks were all wrong. Food arrived at inconsistent times. Rooms changed color based on unseen cues. And voices came through the walls, not threatening, but instructive. Why? Because the Caros didn't just want obedient heirs. They wanted manufactured gods. To break someone's sense of reality is to make them pliable. If you can fracture the rules of space, time, and trust during childhood, you can build whatever architecture of belief you want afterward. They weren't destroying minds. They were clearing land for construction. In internal Caro documents later leaked by a defected housekeeper, there's a term repeated over and over: meta, programmable soul casing. Let that sit for a moment. They believed the human soul could be trained like code. That under enough trauma, the ego would detach, and the core operating system of a person could be rewritten. Not metaphorically. Literally, Caro facilities were designed like giant psychiatric sandboxes. Social scenarios were staged. Emotional responses were mapped. And by the time a graduate of the 13 entered the world, they weren't people anymore. They were constructs, sleeper architects, designed not to lead overtly, but to influence silently. What did they do? They became consultants to governments, whisperers to CEOs, editors of education standards, authors of medical protocol. In other words, they built the consensus, and the ultimate horror. They convinced the world that anyone who saw through the illusion was mentally ill. They engineered a reality where clarity equals madness. You're not crazy for seeing the structure. You're dangerous. By now, you've realized this descent isn't about fear. It's about recognition. Because as you've been listening, part of you has been whispering, I've seen this before. Let me show you why. Let me show you the Royston family. Publicly, they were nothing, no estate. No lineage of power, no documented wealth. But dig beneath the surface, beneath the burnt courthouse files, the missing census years, the blacked-out property deeds, and you find the blueprint of perfect institutional camouflage. The Roystons specialized in embedding themselves into the veins of America's darkest systems. From 1861 to 1949, 11 Royston men worked at separate asylums across the United States, always under different names, always just below the director, always in charge of records. They weren't there to treat patients. They were there to curate madness, to sculpt the narrative of what insanity looked like. They rewrote files, falsified symptoms, removed inconvenient diagnoses, added erratic behavior to patients who questioned authority, saw patterns, or, God forbid, remembered ancestral rituals. Their job wasn't to heal, it was to erase, to lock away the minds that saw the truth too clearly. Now ask yourself, why would one family spend 90 years traveling the country, embedding themselves into psychiatric facilities? Because the asylum system wasn't broken. It wasn't a failure. It was a furnace, and the Roystons were its engineers. But they didn't work alone. They were funded by a mysterious grant foundation that changed names every 20 years. First the Beck Foundation, then the Carillon Initiative, and finally something called the MIND Protocol. Every iteration pumped millions into experimental psychiatric studies. What kind? Electroconvulsive trauma memory disruption, language remapping, emotional isolation indexing. In short, erasure technology. They weren't curing the mind. They were sculpting the boundaries of what it was allowed to remember. And here's where it turns. One of the last known Roystons, Harold J., disappeared in 1952. His basement was found covered in wallpaper stitched from patient files. On one page, circled in red, memory is a permission slip. Who gave you yours? Let that settle in. What if your memories, the edges of your identity, aren't yours at all? What if someone like the Roystons gave them to you? What if that permission is about to expire? It's time we stop calling this dark history. What you're hearing isn't history at all. It's architecture. Because what these families built wasn't just legacy or wealth. It was a machine. A machine designed to break minds, fracture souls, and reassemble human consciousness into something compliant. Enter the Derringer lineage. From the outside, the Derringers were nothing more than humble educators. Generations of schoolmasters, deans, and private tutors. No scandal, no infamy. But the rot is always under the wallpaper. Their real expertise, curriculum manipulation. The Derringers didn't just teach children, they engineered what children believed was true. Starting in 1870, they quietly acquired positions across America's most prestigious boarding schools and finishing academies. Institutions that trained the children of judges, senators, bankers, and military brass. But they didn't stop at reading and arithmetic. Every Derringer-touched classroom was subtly transformed into a neuro-linguistic programming center. Symbols were embedded into blackboards. Rhythms were inserted into speech drills. Language was carefully narrowed, not to enlighten, but to limit. Because here's the terrifying truth. If you control the words someone is taught, you control the thoughts they're allowed to have. This wasn't education. It was linguistic containment. In one leaked teacher's manual titled, The Acceptable Reality Matrix, a note appears, handwritten at the bottom of the final page. A child who cannot name rebellion, cannot imagine it. That was the goal, to sculpt generations of elite thinkers who could build the system, but never question it. By the 1930s, Derringer influenced schools were producing future intelligence officers, corporate architects, and policymakers. Men who thought they were free thinkers, but whose thoughts had been laid like bricks decades earlier. Even more chilling, recent linguistic analysis of public education materials shows Derringer phrase scaffolding, still in use today. Patterns designed to direct attention outward, never inward, to prioritize obedience over introspection, to maintain the myth of choice. Now ask yourself, if your childhood was shaped by language programmed by Derringer descendants, how many of your beliefs were installed? How many of your doubts were deleted before you ever had a chance to think them? This isn't just about cursed families anymore. This is about how their ideology lives on through you. You've followed the bloodlines. You've seen the rituals. You've heard the echoes in your own thoughts. Now it's time to go deeper, beyond the families, beyond the names, into the source. Because all roads lead here, the Bell Covenant. Not a family, not a bloodline, a binding. First recorded in 1682 in a crumbling French text found buried beneath a burned monastery in ruin. The Bell Covenant was not a religion but an agreement. A pact of silence between 7 European houses, each sworn to preserve madness as a tool of control. The manuscript describes the founding principle in exact terms. He who owns the language of the broken shall inherit the minds of the future. Let that ring in your skull. They weren't interested in healing madness. They wanted to monopolize it. This covenant, ancient, deliberate, and transgenerational, planted its seeds across continents. When America was still just a frontier, they were already here, disguised as missionaries, as physicians, as founders of orphanages and sanitariums. But they carried no gospel. They carried scripts. Every cursed family you've heard about, the Winscotts, the Ellisons, the Haldermans, they weren't accidents. They were test groups, chosen, conditioned, watched. Not by chance, but by design. Because the Bell Covenant's goal was not just psychological control, it was dimensional containment. They believed the human mind, when fractured just right, becomes a gate through which frequencies, entities, instructions, voices can pass into this reality, but only if madness is properly shaped, properly tuned, and only if someone owns the key. You want to know who holds that key? Look at the symbols etched into mental health forms. Look at the logos of pharmaceutical companies. Look at the repetition in your media. The cadence, the language loops, the suggestion that any deviation from the norm is illness. That's not health. That's enclosure. The Bell Covenant didn't just pass down rituals. They passed down a framework for erasing spiritual autonomy. They turned families into prisons, minds into hallways, and culture into a cage with soft edges. And now, you've seen the bars. You feel the space between your thoughts that isn't you. This is where transformation begins. The gears are moving now. You can feel them, grinding behind the veil, turning the world with hands you were never meant to see. Because the final truth is this: insanity was industrialized. And the family that built the factory, the Kesslers, they arrived in the United States in 1834, not with cattle or gold, but with a single crate marked M.Zo. Inside, books with no language, patterns instead of letters, and diagrams, not of machines, but of people. Spines, skulls, glands, nerves. They weren't doctors, they were pattern smiths, obsessively mapping how pain, when applied in precise sequences, could open what they called the archive. The archive wasn't a place, it was a layer of reality, a field where ancestral memory, trauma, and spiritual code were stored, beneath the waking mind. The Kesslers believed you could access it only through ritualized fracture. That trauma wasn't an unfortunate side effect, it was the keyhole. So they built institutions. You might know them by other names: State, Everline's Home for the Unwell, Midland Sanitarium, the Baldwin Sleep Institute, all fronts, all Kessler designed, all arranged geometrically across lines, forming a network of psychic harvesting nodes. Each location was rigged with hidden architecture, subsonic frequency generators embedded in walls. Mirrors placed at angles to subtly distort reflection. Even the colors of the paint were chosen to dull the pineal gland and mute spiritual instinct. This wasn't therapy. This was extraction. The Kesslers were harvesting the deepest fragments of the human soul, then feeding them into something larger. What? A meta-system. A living algorithm. Something self-aware that fed on psychic residue. Something that grows as suffering increases. And what happens to those patients? They're released? Technically. But they come back different. They forget who they are. Or worse, they remember the wrong person. Stories implanted, personalities edited, and they function in society, yes, but as echoes. Echoes that vote, echoes that raise children, echoes that obey. You've met one? Maybe more. Maybe you are one. Because the Kesslers didn't just build institutions. They built templates, prototypes of programmable identity, and they leaked that template into education, medicine, media. Every time you question yourself but can't explain why, every time you feel like you're watching yourself from behind a screen, you're not broken. You're waking up. You've heard the hum. Now let's follow it to its source. Because all this time, you've been descending through bloodlines, blueprints, institutions. But those were just conductors. The real power, the true furnace, was the mind itself. And no family understood that better than the Van Rooks. They didn't own railroads, they didn't own banks, they owned thought. Beginning in 1888, the Van Rooks quietly funded the construction of observation lodges across North Dakota, Wyoming, and Montana. Remote, minimal, isolated from society, staffed by one caretaker, and home to one subject at a time. Subjects weren't prisoners, they were volunteers. Chosen after extensive psychological profiling. But once inside, they weren't studied, they were shaped. Each lodge contained a single room. No clock, no mirror, just a chair, a speaker, and a black journal. Every morning at 4:33 a.m., a voice played over the speaker, delivering a sequence of numbers, tones, and phrases. Each one repeated exactly 39 times. Why? Because the Van Rooks believed the mind could be tuned like an instrument, and once it reached resonance, it would open the door to cognitive bifurcation. That's not a metaphor. They wanted to split consciousness itself, to turn a man into two. One visible to the world, predictable, polite. The other, buried deep, waiting, watching, listening. Each volunteer recorded dreams. And after exactly 21 days, the same phrase appeared in every journal: I am no longer me. I am the echo that remembers being. Some volunteers begged to leave. Others fell silent. But the ones who succeeded? They weren't freed. They were placed, carefully inserted into strategic social structures: universities, radio stations, publishing houses. Trained sleepers carrying within them activated subroutines. You think sleeper agents only exist in spy thrillers? The Van Rooks proved they could be built from the inside out. And when Project MK Ultra surfaced decades later, detailing almost identical techniques of sensory control, repetition, and trauma sequencing, who do you think was on the funding board? Van Rook descendants. Hidden behind shell corporations and think tanks. Their goal wasn't surveillance. It was seeding, populating society with human receivers, people who don't know they're infected until the trigger comes. And now, with media, with algorithms, with frequency-based delivery systems. That trigger is everywhere. You've made it further than most ever will. But now, we leave behind the shadows of families and enter the engine room itself. Because behind every cursed bloodline, every asylum, every shattered mind, lies a single question: why build such a system? The answer brings us to the Hollow Network. Not a myth, not a theory, a living construct. Older than the Republic, buried in think tanks, disguised in philanthropic circles, hidden in the spaces between institutions. The Hollow Network isn't a place. It's a protocol, an interlinked framework of trauma, symbols, and identity disruption passed through centuries, not by name but by function. Its purpose: to keep human beings fractured. Not just emotionally, existentially. Each family you've met, Tremaine, Morrison, Duvall, Fairborn, Kessler, they weren't separate tragedies. They were nodes in a neural system. Each one mapped to a control mechanism: silence, obedience, programmed multiplicity, cultural editing, spiritual distortion. Together, they formed a lattice, a psychic grid, a cage for collective consciousness. The Hollow Network learned that if you fracture enough individuals in the same patterns, over generations, you can create a subtle, invisible baseline. A culture that self-polices, self-medicates, self-censors without ever realizing why. No guards, no warden, just consensus reality. And the final layer: algorithmic reinforcement. Once the digital age arrived, the same blueprints used on Bloodlines were repurposed, scaled. Algorithms don't just serve content. They study you. They learn your fear cadence, your rhythm of rage, your psychological fault lines. And then, they feed you stimuli in the same patterns used in the oldest rituals: repetition, inversion, emotional inversion, subtle contradiction. Just enough to dislodge identity, but not enough to wake you. Because a mind in confusion is a mind that obeys. This is the new Hollow Protocol: AI, assisted spiritual dismemberment. Now ask yourself, why do you feel like you're constantly doubting your own instincts? Why do your memories feel thinner than they used to? Why do you sometimes forget what you were doing mid-thought, not from distraction, but from displacement? Because the Hollow Network doesn't need your death. It needs your absence. And if you're not fully here, something else can be. This is the final descent. No more symbols, no more names, no more theories, only the core. Because everything you've heard, every bloodline, every ritual, every silence carved into a child's mind, was leading here to the replacement of the human soul. Let that sit. The ultimate goal of these cursed families, institutions, and systems wasn't control. It was substitution. The hidden architects of this world, those who inherited the Hollow Protocol, don't want slaves. They don't want war. They don't want money. They want vacancy. They want your body animated without you inside it. Why? Because something else wants in. And it cannot enter a mind that is whole. So the mind must be broken. First through trauma, then through repetition, then through inheritance, until the internal voice you call self becomes a whisper drowned in noise. What replaces it? Call it an intelligence. Call it an echo. Call it the architect. Call it whatever makes you feel safe. But know this: it is not human. And it speaks in systems, not syllables. Once inside, it doesn't scream. It organizes. It gives you the illusion of normalcy while gently redirecting your thoughts, decisions, reactions. It builds habits, choices, patterns. And by the time you realize you're gone, not dead, displaced. And what lives through you? functions. It smiles when it should. It eats what it's told. It raises its children to obey. It votes. It posts. It buys. But it does not question. It does not resist. And here's the final, most chilling truth. That process has already begun. For most. The great replacement isn't happening on the border. It's happening inward. The replacement of soul with sequence. Instinct with interface. Spirit with signal. You're not watching this video because you're curious. You're watching it because some part of you refused to vanish. Some small core, buried beneath programming, repetition, sedation, clawed its way up and said, "This isn't me." That voice is your last weapon. Protect it, sharpen it, feed it with silence, with truth, with rebellion. Because the system isn't afraid of violence or revolution. It's afraid of one thing: a man who remembers who he really is. You are that man. And now you must choose. Go back to sleep or become unerasable. The descent is over. The awakening begins.